breakout session is titled Identity and Politics in Israel. Pleased to have with us today Professor Jonathan Reinhold, Professor of Political Studies from Bar Ilan University in Israel. He is the Deputy Head of the Department of Political Studies and also a senior researcher at the Sadat Begin Center for Strategic Studies, receiving his PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he was a visiting professor of Israeli politics at George Washington University in 2012-2013. His research focuses on U.S.-Israel relations, the peace process, role of political culture in international relations. His recent book, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture, was published by Cambridge in 2015. Jonathan, the virtual podium is yours.
It's really my honor and my pleasure to be here with you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the different elements and subgroups in Israel, their identity, and how this plays out in our politics. The most significant identity divide in the state of Israel is between citizens which are Jews and citizens which are Arabs. And you can see here that there are about 7 million Jews, about 80% of Israelis are Jewish, about 20% are Arab. That includes East Jerusalem, but it doesn't include the West Bank and Gaza. If you were to exclude East Jerusalem, you could knock a couple of percentage points off. In terms of demographic trends, Jews and Arabs within the state of Israel have about the same birth rate now, and Jews are slightly higher. So that's pretty stable. As you can see, there's been a big fall in the birth rate among Israeli Arabs over the last 50 years. If we go with Israeli Jews, what you have to begin with is that the word Jewish in Israel, its primary meaning is national identity, and its secondary meaning is religion, tradition, all those sorts of things. So whereas Americans tend to think of Jewishness as a religious thing, for Israelis it's primarily belonging to the Jewish people. Now, there are several different sub-identities in Israel. You can go by ethnicity on the left, which you see about half of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi, which means that they, or more likely their parents and grandparents, immigrated to Israel from the Middle East, from North Africa or Arab countries. The remaining half are Ashkenazi, of European origin or Western origin, and most of those came to Israel in the early years, but 15%, a million Russians came after the end of the Cold War in the decade following the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s. Those are the main ethnic Jewish divisions. Perhaps more important are the religious identities, the different religious divisions. The largest amount of Israeli Jews would just say, I'm just Jewish. Non-religious, secular, just Jewish. The next largest group would say they're traditional, which means they would observe more elements of Jewish religious tradition, like maybe keeping kosher, but they would not consider themselves commanded by God to observe the religion. They keep it as a tradition. The remaining 20% of Israeli Jews are Orthodox. They're religious, and about half are ultra-Orthodox, or Haredi in Hebrew, and about half are national religious, or in American terms, modern Orthodox. Now, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that the word religious in Israel means Orthodox, socially. Only 5% of Israeli Jews, and that's a very high estimate, are Reform or Conservative, whereas the majority of American Jews are Reform or Conservative. And what you see is there's a crossover between ethnicity and religious identity. So if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that Ashkenazim are more likely to be Chiloniim, to be secular, And Sephardim are more likely to be Dati, religious, or Masorti, traditional. So there's an overlap of these identities, of religious and ethnic Jewish identities. Religion tends to go with Mizrahi, and secular is more Ashkenazi. What are the common elements of Israeli Jewish identity that frame the political system, on which there's a consensus? It's basically that Israel should be a Jewish and a democratic state. Now, what that exactly means, there's plenty of argument, but there is some basic core foundation, and that is that Israel is the homeland of any Jew in the world, and that any Jew in the world should have the right to immigrate to Israel. You can see that's 98, 99%, and it doesn't matter what your religious orientation is. Of course, religious and secular Jews will define who is a Jew differently, but the idea that all Jews have a right to live here, everyone agrees on that. The other thing that has very large degree of support is that about 90% of Israeli Jews think that Israel should be a democracy, and that that's important to them, either 2/3 to a very large extent or a quarter to a large extent. They may differ on what they mean by democracy, and they may differ on what they mean by Jewish, and that is the identity politics among Jews, but they all agree that these are the words, these are the concepts that bind us together, that make us Israeli Jews. What are the political divisions that are related to identity in Israel? There are two big ones. One is to do with land, peace, Israeli Palestinians, Palestinian state, all of those sorts of things. And if you look at a survey that was done a few years ago by Pew, you can see that basically Jews are divided half-half on whether Israel can coexist with a Palestinian state or not. And what you can see is that the more Haredi you are, the more Dati you are, the more religious you are in Orthodox terms, the less likely you are to believe that coexistence is possible. And the more secular, Chiloni you are, or the more you're just traditional, the more likely it is that you believe that it is possible for Israel and a Palestinian state to coexist. So you have the ethnic divide, which overlaps with the religious divide, which overlaps with the right-left divide on land and peace. The other divide is on the role of religion in the state, the role of religion in politics. The United States separates between religion and state, but really the overwhelming majority of democracies do not separate between religion and state. France does, the United States does, but the other European countries do not. They have official religions, but they have freedom of religion. So the individual is free to be whatever religion they want, and religious groups can receive state funding. So in Britain and in Germany, Jewish schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools can receive government funding so long as they teach the national curriculum. Now in Israel, 13 different religious groups receive state funding, including Catholics and Protestants, Muslims, Orthodox Jews, but not non-Orthodox Jews, except in Modi'in, where I live. But the ideological divide, the identity divide, can be summed up in this pie chart from 2009, which says, what do you do when there's a contradiction between Orthodox Jewish law, halacha, and democratic principles? Which should be given preference? And what you see is almost half say democracy should always be given preference. 20% say halacha should always be given preference, and 36% say, well, sometimes this and sometimes that. So the two big questions of Israeli politics that bring in identity are to do with religion and to do with the peace process or Arab-Israeli conflict. But just so that we don't get confused, when we use left and right in Israel, if you look on the left, you'll see that the left identity has fallen massively over the last 20 years. The right identity and the center identity have gone up. And if you compare that to the United States, where you look at conservative, liberal, and moderate, which I've done on the right-hand side, you'll see it's very stable. And that's because left and right in Israel are not as stable as liberal and conservative in America. So you can see that between 1999 and 2001, there's a massive change in the identity of Israelis, a big jump for right and a big fall for left. And the reason for that is the collapse of the Oslo peace process. What I'm saying is left and right in Israel are things that are very much affected by what the state of relations between Israel and the Palestinians and Israel and the region is. So the center goes up in 2005, 2006. That's when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. And that was very much a centrist policy because it said, look, we want to get out of Gaza because we don't want to control Gaza. We don't want to rule over so many Palestinians. We want to preserve the Jewish majority in Israel. But we don't think we can get peace. That would be the left view. And we don't think that Gazan territory, because it's part of the land of Israel, is the most important thing. That would be the right view. Since then, when as a result of withdrawing from Gaza and Lebanon, Israel got lots of rockets, support for the center has gone down, support for the left has gone down, and support for the right has gone up because people don't believe withdrawals will bring them security. But, as I said, these things can change. Although the religious are always more to the right and the secular are always more to the left, it still goes up and down more than Republican, conservative, liberal, and Democrat in the US. What about Israeli Arabs? About 20% of all Israeli citizens. We can understand their identities and sub-identities in two ways. We can look at religious communal membership. The Druze, about 10%, Christians, about 10%, Muslims, about 80%. Those are three different religious groups, and they are the dominant communities. But if we do surveys and we ask the question, what is your primary identity? Remember, people can have multiple identities. But if I ask you, what's the primary identity? The largest one is Arab. I'm first and foremost an Arab. The second one is my religious identity. I'm first and foremost a Muslim. I'm first and foremost a Christian. I'm first and foremost a Druze. There aren't many Shiites in Israel. The Muslims are overwhelmingly Sunni. What's interesting is that only about 10%, 15% of Israeli Arabs identify first and foremost as Israeli. Most of those are Druze. And a little bit more, but sometimes it's a little bit less because it moves around, identify first and foremost as Palestinian. Most Israeli Arabs would say, I'm Israeli, I'm Palestinian, I'm my religious identity, and I'm an Arab. But when you ask them which identity is the most important, Palestinian isn't it. It's either Arab or Muslim. What about Jewish-Arab relations? On what elements do they share some kind of commonality? And when do their identities come into conflict in politics? These are the answers to survey questions by the Israeli Democracy Institute from 2017 and 2019. And the first thing that you can see on the left is that the social relations between Jews and Arabs in the workplace are very good, which is perhaps a bit surprising to you given the riots, the violence that we saw only a few weeks ago. But not everybody is a thug In fact, very few people are thugs. And the vast majority of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs say they get on very well or well in the workplace. Very few say they don't get on well. Also, the overwhelming majority see Israel as a good place to live, both Jews and Arabs. And perhaps more interestingly, a majority of Jews and Arabs believe that the state should prepare to implement a comprehensive plan for closing gaps between Arab citizens and Jewish citizens. And what you see is that the secular agree most, then traditional Jews, then religious Jews. Haredi Jews are the only ones who don't agree. And perhaps surprising to you is that a majority of right-wing Israelis also agree. And so if we're now trying to understand how two right-wing parties can be in a coalition with an Arab party, this is why. Because if the Arab party focuses on civic and economic issues, the well-being of the Arab community, and not national issues, then there's no problem. There's no identity politics in equalizing money for education, access to higher education, employment opportunities, infrastructure, not a problem. What is a problem? These are the divisions between Arabs and Jews on identity issues and intra-Arab differences. So let's start on the left with intra-Arab differences. In 2017, the Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the Adenauer Foundation did a survey of Israeli Arabs. And they asked them, how much do you feel you've got personal freedom in Israel? How stable do you feel your economic situation and your social situation is? And how strong is your sense of belonging to Israel? And what you see here is that the Druze who serve in the Israeli army feel the greatest sense of belonging, followed by Christians, followed by Muslims. Christians and Druze feel a high level of personal freedom. Christians are more liberal than Druze and Muslims, and Druze are more liberal than Muslims. Druze and Christians are also economically better off than Muslims. So there is a divide on a sense of belonging to Israel, where Druze feel the strongest sense of belonging, then Christians, then Muslims. Why are the Christian numbers lower? Well, historically, there are simply more Muslims in this area than Christians. Israel is the only country in the Middle East in which the Christian population has grown over the last 25 years. That's one reason. The second reason is that Muslim and Druze birth rates are higher than Christian birth rates. Muslim birth rates, I think, around 5 kids or 4 kids. Christians is like 2, and Druze is somewhere in the middle. That also has something to do with it. So they start from a higher position and their birth rate is higher. What about divides between Jews and Arabs in Israel over identity issues? For Israeli Jews, we've said that Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state is completely supported by almost all Jews. For Israeli Arabs, it's controversial. It does go up and down because it partly depends on Jewish-Arab relations, what's going on in the political arena, what's going on with Israeli-Palestinian relations, how bad is it to be an Arab outside of Israel in the region? That will also affect it. So it went up between 2008 and 2015, not because necessarily there was a more positive approach between Jews and Arabs in Israel, but because when Israeli Arabs looked out the window, they saw 500,000 Syrian Arabs being massacred in Syria. They saw revolutions all over the region leading to chaos, and they saw corruption and poverty in the Palestinian areas of Gaza and the West Bank. That made Israel look better. So Israeli Arabs are divided between themselves on how much their ideologically reconciled to Israel, and Jews and Arabs are, of course, divided on it. On the land of Israel, Palestine, historic rights. In other words, do I recognize your right to be here, or do I just understand it in pragmatic terms? You'll see that the situation has declined. Less people recognize both sides' historic rights. But once again, both sides are divided on this. Arabs are internally divided, and Jews are internally divided. Arabs are also internally divided about the Israeli political system and democracy. About 2/3 of Arabs thinks that Israel is a democracy for Arabs as well, whatever its shortcomings. And a little over 1/3 say it isn't. A little over 2/3 of Israeli Arabs believe that they can improve their situation by politically engaging in Israel. About 1/3 don't think so. So if we want to understand Arab identity politics, what we see is a tension on the one hand between wanting to engage to improve your situation, your political rights, your economic situation, your educational opportunities, and a distancing from the ideological identity of Israel as a Jewish state, a uncomfortableness with it, a division, and a Jewish uncomfortableness that Arab don't accept the core values of the Jewish state. So those fears, those mutual fears, mix with the fact that socially they get on, and that if you just ask about individual rights and economic well-being, there's no problem. As soon as you start to talk about political identity, identity politics and divisions kick in. How does this play out in terms of political parties? Now, Israeli political parties change their name at least twice a week. So it's much more complicated than Republicans and Democrats. So rather than bamboozle you with names, I'm going to talk about political identities. So you have the Arab parties, who most of the Arabs, but not all of the Arabs, vote for. The Zionist left, the center, the right, the far right, and the ultra-Orthodox or Haredim. Today, the Arab parties are in two groups. One is called the Joint List, and it's a combination of three parties, and they are nationalist and left-wing, but to varying degrees. Balad is anti-Zionist. It's against the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Hadash is non-Zionist. It was originally a communist party, but it's as communist as the Republicans now. It's meaningless. But it's non-Zionist, which means it accepts as legitimate Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state, but it doesn't support it. If that's what the majority in Israel want, that's fine. We personally, Hadash voters, we're not into that, but it's perfectly legitimate. The other party is Ra'am, and that's the party, the first Arab party to be a signatory to an Israeli coalition agreement. It's not the first Arab party to be part of a coalition, but it's the first one to play such a major role officially. And the interesting thing about Ra'am is that it is an Islamist party, a moderate Islamist party that represents the Bedouin of the Negev, very tribal. And it said, and this was a first, we don't care whether it's a right-wing government or a left-wing government. We want money to improve the lot of the Arabs in Israel, and particularly the Bedouins. We want more money for policing because there's a violent crime wave in the Arab sector. We want to deal with housing and educational opportunities. There was another Islamist party, was called the Northern Branch, and it was headed by Riyad Salah, and he's now, or was, in prison. And they were a radical Islamist party opposed to the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Some members of Balad and some members of the northern branch were implicated in support for terrorism. But Ra'am was not, and Naftali Bennett, the new Prime Minister of Israel, apologized last week on television for saying the head of Ra'am, Mansour Abbas, had supported terrorism. He apologized, and he noted that Mansour Abbas, after the riots in the mixed city of Lod, he'd gone to the synagogue there that burnt down and promised to be involved in rebuilding it. Let's move to the Zionist left. That's the Labour Party and Meretz. You'd recognize them as basically Democrats in America, individual rights, social rights, peace, separation of religion and state. That's what they're into. The center is Yesh Atid and Blue and White today. They're into individual rights, less social rights, but in Israel, the center would be on the left in America economically. In Israel, the state-run health system, the right wing support it as well. Economics is not a big issue in Israel. Security, the cost of living are important. Making the Haredim serve either in the army or national service is important. Then there's the right, which is Likud, Yamina, and New Hope. The far right, which at the moment is called religious Zionism, but religious Zionism isn't necessarily all on the far right. They're into settlements, they are anti-Arab. And then there's the Haredim. There's two major parties. There's United Torah Judaism, that's mainly Ashkenazi, and Shas, which is mainly Mizrahi. And they're interested in two things: the sectoral economic interests, money for yeshivot, money for social welfare because they have large families, and legislation informed by Orthodox religious law. So, for example, that conversions can only be Orthodox and that non-Orthodox conversions will not be recognized, or that you can't sell bread on Passover, things like that. What I've tried to do to finish off is just give you a bit of color. What do these identities look like? On the far left, you have the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. For those of you who know the world-famous smash hit TV series Shtisel, those are characters from Shtisel. In the middle is Aryeh Deri and his wife Yafa, and they're Sephardi ultra-Orthodox, or Mizrahi in Shas. On the far right is one of the leaders of the religious Zionist party, and you can see he's called Chardal because it's sort of closer to the ultra-Orthodox, but it's moving into the modern. Then in the bottom right, you have Naftali Bennett and his wife. Now, Naftali Bennett, you see he's got a small kippah, whereas Smotrich's children above him have big kippot. Naftali Bennett is what we call religious light. He's Orthodox, but not as punctilious. His wife doesn't wear head covering. She shows her arms. She's less modest in her dress, but they're religious. Then you have Yair Lapid and his wife. They're secular. He is the head of Yesh Atid. Then you have Natan Sharansky, who represents, if you like, the Russian immigrants in Israel. And the final one is Gila Gamliel, who's a Likud MK of Mizrahi extraction. So that, if you like, is a little tour of Jewish identity politics in Israel. What about Arab identity politics in Israel? In the bottom left, you have the man of the moment, Mansour Abbas, who's entering the government from Ra'am. Above him, you have a radical, secular, anti-Zionist former MK, the bête noire of Jewish Israelis, Hanid Zouabi. In the little box between Zouabi and Abbas is Frej, who's an Arab MK of Meretz, a left-wing Jewish party. Above him, you have Riyad Salah, who's a radical Islamic fundamentalist who's banned from running in Israeli elections. In the bottom center, you have Ayman Odeh with a supporter. He's the head of the United Arab List, and he's a Hadash member. And on the right, you have 3 Israeli Arabs who've made it into the mainstream. In the top right-hand corner, you have Salim Gibran, who was Israel's first Arab Supreme Court justice. Next to him, you have a woman who was the first Druze high-ranking officer in the Israeli police. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you have a Druze officer in the IDF, in the Israeli army, who was the military advisor to the former president of the State of Israel, Reuven Rivlin.